The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across Maplewood Estates, one of those suburban neighborhoods that looked like it belonged on the cover of a real estate brochure. Every lawn was trimmed to perfection, fences gleamed with fresh paint, and the sidewalks were free of even a stray weed. The hum of sprinklers and the distant laughter of children created an illusion of order and peace, but beneath the polished exterior, there was tension, a tension that always seemed to rise whenever Mark Reynolds was on patrol. In his mid-50s, carried himself with the authority of a man who believed he was indispensable. He was not an actual police officer, not by training, not by title, and certainly not by jurisdiction. Yet, to the residents of Maplewood Estates, Mark acted like the law itself. With a clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and a walkie-talkie clipped proudly to his belt, he strutted along the sidewalks as if he were keeping the neighborhood safe from an invading army. He wore his HOA badge like it was a sheriff's star, and with his stiff posture and booming voice, he treated every homeowner as a suspect waiting to be caught in the act of non-compliance. So, when a new moving truck rumbled to a stop in front of Lot 17, Mark's eyes narrowed with suspicion. The truck's arrival was not on his schedule. He hadn't received any notifications, and in his world, that meant one thing: a violation. From the truck's back ramp, Clara Mitchell stepped down, her movements deliberate and steady. She was in her early 40s, with a natural air of confidence that required no flash to announce itself. Dressed in a casual blouse and fitted jeans, her dark hair tied neatly back, she didn't look like someone desperate to impress the neighborhood. She looked like someone who already knew exactly who she was and needed no one's approval. In her hands, she carried a medium-sized box, the first of many. "Excuse me," Mark barked, striding across the cul-de-sac with his clipboard tucked under his arm. His voice carried the sharpness of a drill sergeant, instantly drawing a few neighbors' eyes from behind their blinds. Lara set the box down on the porch and turned, offering a polite but questioning look. She said calmly. Mark stopped a few feet from her, adjusting his badge so it gleamed in the sunlight. "You can't just park that truck here. This neighborhood has rules, strict rules, and I don't recall approving a move-in on Lot 17. Clara tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Approving?" she echoed softly. "That's right," Mark said, puffing out his chest. "As HOA enforcement officer, it's my duty to maintain order around here, and your truck is already blocking visibility near the corner. That's a finable offense. You also can't unload boxes past 6 p.m. It's in the bylaws." And he waved vaguely at the house. "If you're repainting those shutters, they'd better be an HOA-approved color." Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile, though not mocking, more like someone listening patiently to a child explain how the world works. "I see," she said. "And you are?" Mark's eyes flashed. He wasn't used to being asked that. "Mark Reynolds, head of HOA compliance. Everyone here knows me." Well, Clara replied evenly. "I am not everyone." Mark blinked, thrown for just a second by her composure. Around them, two neighbors paused on their evening walks, pretending to check their mailboxes while clearly listening. A curtain twitched across the street, revealing a pair of eyes peeking through. The air felt heavier now. The neighborhood, usually serene, was suddenly holding its breath. Mark leaned in slightly, his voice lowering but dripping with authority. "Look, lady, we run a tight ship here. This isn't the kind of place where people just come and go as they please. There's an order to things, and if you want to live here, you'll need to follow the rules. My rules." Clara didn't flinch. She simply picked up the box she had set down earlier, cradling it in her arms with the same grace she carried in her voice. "Is that so?" she asked softly. Mark smirked, mistaking her calm for submission. "That's exactly so. I've been running this HOA for over a decade. Nothing gets past me, and if you think you can just stroll in here without clearance, you've got another thing coming." The smirk widened as he clicked his pen, ready to jot down what he called violations. But Clara simply studied him, her eyes steady, her voice even. "Well then, Mr. Reynolds," she said, stepping up the porch with her box, "this should be interesting." The neighbors leaning in from the sidelines felt the shift, though they couldn't name it. It was subtle, like the first gust of wind before a storm. Mark thought he had cornered another rule breaker, but Clara's calm assurance told a different story. And very soon, Mark Reynolds would discover just how fragile his little empire of control truly was. Mark Reynolds stood at the edge of Clara's driveway, clipboard balanced like a weapon, pen ready to strike. His eyes darted from the moving truck to the house, scanning for anything he could twist into a violation. He had built his reputation in Maplewood Estates on being relentless, and he wasn't about to let a new arrival undermine his authority on day one. "Let's start with this," he declared, pointing at the moving truck with the flair of a courtroom prosecutor. "That vehicle has been parked here for over 30 minutes, which is beyond the 20-minute unloading limit. Section 4, Paragraph 2, Subsection B." He tapped his clipboard as if the sound itself carried legal weight. Clara set down another box on the porch. Straightening her posture, she didn't argue, didn't even frown. She just looked at him with calm patience, like someone listening to a radio drone on in the background. Mark wasn't used to this kind of silence. Usually, new residents scrambled, fumbling for apologies or excuses. The lack of reaction only made him more determined. "And your shutters?" He pointed to the faded green frames around her windows. "That color is not on the HOA-approved palette. Only beige, white, or colonial blue are permitted." "That's another fine." Clara tilted her head, following his finger. The shutters looked perfectly fine to her, though a little weathered from time. "They've been that color for years," she said evenly. "Exactly," Mark shot back, his voice booming. "Which means they should have been updated years ago. My reports show this property has been neglected. You can't just waltz in and think it'll be ignored." By now, a small audience had gathered. A man walking his dog slowed to a stop, pretending to adjust the leash while listening intently. Two teenage boys riding bikes circled the cul-de-sac, smirking at the tension. Curtains twitched in more than one house, and the quiet suburb suddenly felt like an open-air stage. Mark relished the attention. He lived for these moments when the neighborhood could see him take charge. He scribbled furiously on his clipboard: parking infraction, shutter infraction, landscaping non-compliance. His eyes swept across the lawn, pausing at a small cluster of wildflowers blooming near the walkway. He sneered. "And those? Not approved. HOA requires uniform plantings. Halsies, tulips, hydrangeas. Wildflowers are messy." "Another fine." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You want to fine me for flowers?" Mark's pen scratched across the page. "Messy flowers. They attract bees. Bees sting children. It's a safety hazard. I enforce safety here." A ripple of chuckles passed through the small crowd. The man with the dog shook his head, muttering something under his breath. The teenagers laughed openly now, one whispering, "Here he goes again." But Mark ignored them. His eyes were locked on Clara, waiting for her to break, to protest, to defend herself in a way that gave him more fuel. That was how it always worked. Intimidation until compliance. Clara, however, did none of those things. She simply folded her arms lightly across her chest, her expression unreadable. Her calmness unnerved him, though he'd never admit it. "I'll have to issue an official notice," Mark continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "That means a fine for each violation. And if you fail to pay promptly, additional penalties will follow. Non-payment can even result in a lien against the property." He let those last words hang in the air like a guillotine blade. He loved that phrase, "lien against the property." It always made people sweat. But Clara didn't sweat. She didn't even blink. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice still soft, steady, and oddly unshaken. "Mr. Reynolds, you seem very dedicated to your role." "Dedicated?" Mark puffed his chest, mistaking her words for praise. "I am the reason Maplewood Estates looks the way it does. Without me, this place would fall apart. One, maintain order. I protect the value of our homes, and in the process," Clara said quietly, her gaze steady on his. "You believe intimidation is the same as authority." The words landed like a pebble in a still pond, small, but rippling outward. A hush fell over the little crowd. Even the teenagers stopped snickering, sensing something different in her tone. Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't like her wording. He didn't like her calm, and he certainly didn't like that people were watching him lose the rhythm of control. "You'll learn quickly," he snapped, forcing his voice louder again, "that this neighborhood follows my rules. And if you don't, you won't last long here." Clara's eyes softened, almost pitying. "We'll see about that." Her words weren't shouted, but they echoed nonetheless, not just in Mark's ears, but in the minds of everyone watching. Because in that moment, though Mark still stood waving his clipboard like a badge of honor, it was becoming clear to the neighbors that the balance of power had already begun to shift, and Mark Reynolds, the self-proclaimed HOA cop, was too blinded by his own arrogance to notice. By now, the little street felt like an impromptu theater. The audience of neighbors had grown. A couple in workout clothes lingered by the curb with their water bottles. A mother with a stroller paused under the shade of an oak tree, and even an elderly man watering his lawn had shut off the hose to watch. Mark thrived on an audience. He always had. To him, the neighbors weren't bystanders, they were witnesses to his authority. And every raised eyebrow, every whispered comment only fueled his determination to put Clara in her place. He squared his shoulders, clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield, and marched up the porch steps, stopping just short of where Clara stood. The air between them seemed to tighten. "Listen carefully," Mark said, his voice slower now, deliberate, dripping with condescension. "This is not just about flowers, or shutters, or pack. This is about respect for the system, for the rules." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear, though the spectators strained to catch every word. "And in this neighborhood, I am the system." Clara met his gaze without flinching. Her stillness was unnerving, like the calm surface of deep water. Mark mistook her silence for hesitation. He pressed on, eager to assert dominance. "Do you know what happens to people who think they're above the age?" He scribbled something on his clipboard with exaggerated strokes. "They get fined into submission, their yards get flagged, their properties lose value, and eventually, they pack up and leave. I've seen it happen. I've made it happen." His eyes glittered with pride. To him, this wasn't bullying, it was victory. The man with the dog muttered under his breath. Power trip. The mother with the stroller shook her head, but still watched. Curiosity keeping her rooted. Mark raised his voice again, making sure everyone could hear. If you want to live here, you'll fall in line. That's how Maplewood Estates works. That's how I work. You don't get to change that. He jabbed his pen toward Clara, the gesture sharp, almost accusatory. You're just a resident, and I'm the one in charge. For the first time, Clara's expression shifted. Not anger, not fear, but something subtler, sharper. The faint trace of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips, as if she knew a secret no one else did. Is that so? She asked quietly, her tone not mocking but laced with something that unsettled him far more than defiance. Certainty. Mark straightened, caught off guard by her calmness yet again. Yes, that's so, he barked, forcing his authority back into his voice. I'm the final word here. My approval decides what stands and what falls in this neighborhood. And if you can't handle that, maybe this isn't the right place for you. The crowd shifted. Some exchanged looks. Others sucked in quiet breaths. Mark's words were bold, even reckless, and everyone knew it. Clara took one step closer, her eyes locked on his, steady, unblinking. She didn't raise her voice, but the firmness in her tone carried farther than his bluster ever could. Mr. Reynolds, she said evenly, it seems you've confused enforcing rules with creating them. And worse, you've confused authority with ownership. Her words cut through the air, slicing away at his bravado. Mark opened his mouth to reply, but for once, no clever retort came. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of her statement to settle over the crowd. Then, with quiet certainty, she added, you are not in charge of me, and very soon, you will see why. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the small audience. The teenagers on their bikes exchanged wide-eyed grins. The elderly man with the hose muttered, oh boy, here we go. Mark's face flushed a deep crimson. His fingers tightened around the pen, the clipboard trembling in his grip. He had built his entire identity around the illusion of control, and for the first time, he felt it slipping. He puffed his chest, desperate to regain footing. We'll see about that, he spat, though his voice cracked just slightly, betraying the first hint of doubt. Clara's calm smile deepened, but she said nothing more. She didn't need to. The stage was set, the audience was hooked, and Mark Reynolds had no idea how close he was to the collapse of his little empire. The cul-de-sac had fallen into a charged silence. Even the cicadas seemed to pause in the trees, as though nature itself waited for what would happen next. Mark Reynolds stood red-faced, his clipboard clutched like a weapon, while Clara remained calm and composed, the faintest glimmer of amusement in her eyes. The neighbors leaned in from their various posts, the joggers, the dog walker, the teenagers on their bikes, the mother with the stroller, and even Mr. Jenkins, the old man who rarely left his porch, now watching intently from his rocking chair. This was no longer just a spat. It had become a spectacle, a showdown between the so-called HOA enforcer and the mysterious new homeowner. Mark cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. You think you can just ignore the rules? You think this neighborhood is your playground? He jabbed the clipboard at her house as if the gesture alone could condemn it. You're just another resident, and you'll answer to me like everyone else. Clara tilted her head slightly, her voice calm as ever. You're very certain about that. I don't need to be certain, Mark barked. I am certain. This is my jurisdiction, my responsibility. And you, he pointed directly at her, you're nothing more than a tenant who had better learn quickly how things work here. The word tenant hung in the air like a spark, waiting for a flame. Clara let it linger for a moment, her eyes scanning the small crowd of neighbors. She could see it in their faces. Some were entertained, some annoyed by Mark's antics, but all of them were hungry for resolution. She set the box she was carrying down gently on the porch and reached into her purse. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. The sound of rummaging, the faint jingle of keys, the shuffle of papers, built a tension that made every eye in the cul-de-sac lock onto her. Finally, Clara pulled out a sleek leather folder. She opened it with a quiet snap and held up a thick, official-looking document. The golden seal on the corner gleamed in the fading sunlight. I am not a tenant, Clara said softly, her voice carrying with the weight of certainty. She stepped forward and handed the document to the nearest onlooker, the man with the dog, who blinked in surprise before instinctively passing it to Mark. Mark frowned, confused, and unfolded the pages. His eyes darted across the legal language, the signatures, the unmistakable county stamp of ownership. His lips moved as he read, though no sound came. The words hit him like a blow. Deed of ownership, 17 Maplewood Estates. Owner Clara Mitchell. Clara folded her arms lightly, her gaze never wavering. This property belongs to me. Not rented, not leased, owned outright. The crowd gasped audibly. The teenagers whooped. Mr. Jenkins let out a low whistle from his porch. Even the mother with the stroller couldn't hide her grin. Mark's face drained of color, then flushed scarlet again in quick succession. His fingers gripped the deed so tightly it crumpled slightly at the edges. He stammered, searching for some foothold. This doesn't change the rules. You still have to answer to the HOA. Clara's voice cut cleanly through his protest. sharp but calm. "I do not answer to you, Mr. Reynolds. You are not the law. You are not the owner. You are not in charge of me or this property. And judging by your behavior," she paused, letting her words sink in, "you've confused your clipboard with authority." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that had been bottled up for years, waiting for someone brave enough to say what they all felt. Mark's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The power that had fueled his bluster, his intimidation, his entire identity in this neighborhood, it evaporated in an instant. Clara reached out and plucked the deed from his trembling hands, sliding it neatly back into her folder. She looked around at the watching neighbors, her expression gracious but firm. "I came here to build a home, not to be bullied. I respect community. I respect rules. But respect is a two-way street, and I will not be treated as if I am beneath someone who only pretends to have authority." The man with the dog clapped quietly. The teenagers joined in with louder applause, one of them calling, "Finally, someone put him in his place." Soon, others added their voices, nods, murmurs of agreement, even a few bold cheers. Mark stood frozen, his authority shredded in front of the very people he had ruled with fear. His clipboard dangled at his side. Suddenly nothing more than a piece of cheap plastic and paper. Clara picked up her box, carrying it into her home with a quiet dignity that made her victory feel complete. As the door closed behind her, the crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with a story they would undoubtedly retell for weeks. How the HOA cop finally met someone he couldn't intimidate, and Mark Reynolds, for the first time in a decade, felt what it was like to be utterly powerless. The night after the confrontation, Maplewood Estates buzzed like a hive. Neighbors who usually kept to themselves lingered at mailboxes, walked their dogs a little slower, or found excuses to water their lawns long after dark. The story spread fast, faster than any official HOA notice ever had. By sunrise the next morning, everyone knew Mark Reynolds, the self-proclaimed HOA cop, had been put in his place, and not just in private but in front of nearly half the cul-de-sac. The details shifted with each retelling. Some swore Clara had waved the deed in his face like a sword. Others said she coolly recited ownership laws like a lawyer, but one detail remained unchanged in every version. Mark had lost and Clara had won. For the first time in years, people spoke about the HOA with laughter instead of dread. Neighbors who had once whispered complaints behind closed doors now shared them openly, chuckling over Mark's obsession with messy flowers or his threats of fines for bees. The illusion of his power had cracked, and through that crack poured years of pent-up frustration. Mark, meanwhile, retreated into silence. He still made his rounds, clipboard in hand, but the swagger was gone. His eyes avoided contact, his steps lacked their usual stomp, and when he spoke, his voice no longer carried the same weight. He had become a figure of pity more than fear. And Clara, she didn't gloat. She didn't rub her victory in anyone's face. Instead, she went about her move-in with quiet dignity, unpacking boxes, planting flowers in her yard, and greeting neighbors with a warm smile. It was this humility, this quiet strength that won people over one evening. A week after the showdown, the mother with the stroller approached Clara as she watered her garden. "I just wanted to say thank you," she admitted, adjusting her baby's blanket. "Most of us were too scared to stand up to him, but you did what we couldn't." Clara smiled softly, turning off the hose. "Sometimes bullies only have as much power as we give them. Respect is important, but it has to be earned, not demanded." The word spread almost as quickly as the story itself. Soon, neighbors began knocking on Clara's door, not to complain, but to connect. They offered cookies, invited her to barbecues, and asked her opinion on small neighborhood matters. Slowly, without ever seeking it, Clara became the voice people trusted. It was not long before whispers began circulating about replacing Mark as HOA chair. At first, Mark dismissed the idea as idle gossip, but when ballots were finally cast at the next community meeting, the results were undeniable. Mark was out, and Clara Mitchell, the woman who had arrived with nothing more than boxes and calm defiance, that was unanimously elected in his place. The shift was immediate. Under Clara's guidance, the HOA stopped being a tool of fear and became what it was meant to be, a framework for cooperation. Rules still existed, but they were enforced with reason and fairness, not intimidation. Fines gave way to conversations, and threats turned into offers of help. Neighbors who had once cowered under Mark's clipboard now felt free to breathe, to plant wildflowers, to let their children ride bikes without fear of scolding. Maplewood Estates remained beautiful, but it was no longer controlled by fear. It was nurtured by respect, and the respect was not forced, but earned. On a warm summer evening, as the neighborhood gathered for a community picnic, the first in years, Clara looked around at the laughter, the children chasing fireflies, the neighbors sharing food and stories. She caught sight of Mark at the edge of the park, sitting alone on a bench, his clipboard gone. For a moment, she considered approaching him. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in spirit, a man stripped of the false authority he had wrapped around himself for too long. Instead of anger, Clara felt a flicker of compassion. Perhaps she thought he had once believed he was doing good. Perhaps he had just lost sight of what true leadership meant. She turned back to the gathering, smiling as a neighbor waved her over. Maplewood Estates had changed, and it had changed because one woman, with calm resolve and quiet strength, had reminded them all of a simple truth. Real authority comes not from fear, but from respect. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the tall oaks lining Maplewood Estates, casting long, warm shadows across the neighborhood. The day's excitement had faded into a gentle calm, punctuated by the laughter of children playing tag and the distant hum of sprinklers, watering freshly trimmed lawns. Clara Mitchell stood on her porch, hands folded lightly in front of her, taking in the scene. The tranquility of the neighborhood was different now, not the quiet of fear and obedience, but the calm that came from understanding and mutual respect. She remembered the first moments she had arrived. Mark Reynolds striding up with his clipboard, chest puffed, ready to assert dominion over every flower, fence, and parking space. Back then, she had seen only rules and intimidation, the illusion of authority that had governed Maplewood Estates for years now. That illusion was gone. Mark, the once feared HOA enforcer, was no longer a figure of intimidation. He walked among the neighbors silently, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. There was no bitterness in Clara's gaze as she watched him, only clarity. She understood that his need for control had come from a place of insecurity, and she also understood that true authority was not something to take, it was something to earn. Clara's phone buzzed, drawing her attention. It was a message from a neighbor, thanking her for the recent leadership and inviting her to the community meeting next week. She smiled softly. Small gestures like this were the reward of genuine leadership. Trust built, not demanded. She turned her gaze back to the children running across the cul-de-sac. A small boy paused to wave at her. She waved back, and the warmth of their innocent respect struck her heart. This was what authority should feel like. Not fear, not compliance, but admiration and trust freely given. In that moment, Clara reflected on the lesson she had inadvertently taught Mark Reynolds, and perhaps the entire neighborhood. Real authority is not about intimidation. It is about integrity, fairness, and the willingness to listen. Her gaze drifted to the setting sun, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Maplewood Estates would continue to thrive, not because rules were enforced by fear, but because respect had been restored. Clara inhaled deeply, letting the calm settle in. Leadership, she realized, was less about being in charge and more about serving others with humility. She had come to this neighborhood to claim a home, but she had left an indelible mark on its heart. And somewhere in the quiet shadows, Mark Reynolds, once the self-appointed authority, would carry this lesson with him. Perhaps he would learn it fully one day, that power wielded without understanding is hollow, but respect earned through fairness and integrity is enduring. Clara stepped inside her home, the leather folder safely tucked under her arm. She closed the door behind her, not as a conqueror, but as a steward. Outside, the neighborhood basked in a new kind of light, one that would not be cast by fear, but by the quiet, unshakable strength of respect. And as the evening air settled over Maplewood Estates, one truth remained clear: intimidation can command attention, but only respect commands loyalty.